let's say, peer review seems to exacerbate um at least some subsets of the scientific enterprise is in the sense that there's a great degree of polarization even across or even in certain fields. So, for instance, let's say if you were to publish a paper in biology today, which would argue that, let's say, gender is determined, let's say, on a chromosomal basis. I think that would receive a lot of pushback even in peer review, and that is
Oh,
something that.
there's pushback, and that's inappropriate, and we need to fight that. We need to fight it, but I think it's temporary, and eventually it'll be self-correcting. But you're right. There are groups that basically, because of fears of somehow offending people, don't let the right science be stated, and it's awful. And that's one of the things we talk about in our book. Um, Sex has a meaning in biology, and gender is much more ephemeral. But sex has a meaning in biology, and there are two sexes in humans, and whether you like it or not, and there it has to do with the size of gametes, and see that some people don't want to say that for fear of offending people who are transgender people. But again, it's important to remember that gender and sex are different. So yeah, there are constraints, there are censorship. Nature by the magazine Nature Behavior, for example, argued that its editors should not publish articles that basically offend people. Just an awful thing, and I think we need to fight that. But that's what I'm saying. The sociology of science is different than science because scientists and publishers of science are people and they can be wrong. And so we fight it and eventually, hopefully, we win.
Just a brief follow-up related to that, and I think I leave the last couple of minutes for questions from the audience if they happen to have any questions. Um,
Sure. No, yeah, that's great. I've really enjoyed your questions, by the way. I've enjoyed our discussion. It's been great.
Thank you so much, sir.
I'm happy to answer some more from the audience if there are any.
Just a final question from my side. I came across a couple of years ago a book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave, and a
Yeah.
bit of his online content. And I think he really attempted to deal with the issue of, let's say, the basis, let's say, of gender identity or gender perception and the sexes. And he seemed to take a stance much more favorable to a certain degree of fluidity in those respects. So, how do you evaluate, let's say, Professor Sapolsky's works in those regards, if you have engaged with his works, that is?
Well, I know Robert Sapolsky well, and we've interacted for a long
Mhm,
time, and we just did a recently a podcast on his more recent book,
mhm,
Determined, about free will. I have great respect for him, great respect for him as a scientist and intellect. Um, I think his efforts to understand the neuroscientific basis of behavior and to recognize that, I mean, even in that book, I think he initially does, and then in his next book, he's more clear about it, that that we're not that we can want to change behavior, but punishing people is a different thing because um, people are often behave well. Our behavior is determined. It's determined by a huge number of things, including biological factors of gender or sex, but also our history, the history of our parents and their parents, and and um, and therefore, bad behavior has at its root many causes. And what we should be trying to do is to try and remove those causes or constrain the behavior. But punishing people is a different thing. And I think he goes to the extreme saying that basically, while if someone commits, a murder, they should be put in jail, but not as punishment, but to be kept, to protect others and eventually to be rehabilitated if it's possible, to change their behavior and then let out. And I think it's a very sensible way of thinking. So I think his books are wonderful and they're pleasant and he's a very interesting person to listen to. And he has such a broad range of understanding of neuroscience and biology and other things that he's wonderful. He was going to be going on a trip my foundation's organizing to Bhutan, but unfortunately he's had to cancel for health reasons. But I really would have loved to have him along.
Mm. Just one final comment before, yeah, we can take up
See
the
one
question by
question in the
Soumya.
chat window, by the way, so that's
Mm.
good to know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think in one of Professor Sapolsky's articles that I came across, he effectively made a very similar point that gender is fluid, but the fact that people are so constrained by our history to view it as a dichotomy means that a coercive attempt to, let's say, impose the acceptance of its fluidity is likely to be counterproductive. And I think that really gels in with his other works about that you just mentioned in his latest book, Determined.
yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a great point. Um, and he, as much as anyone else, realizes the vicissitudes of human behavior, and as I say, gender is a psychological concept as much, or at least one's identification of gender, one's self-identifying gender is psychologically based among many other things, and that's his area of expertise. And once again, I think and that's part of the problem in the United States now. Sure, there's a reaction, the Trump administration, to some of the ridiculous claims about there being more than two sexes, but at the same time they're trying to punish transgender people for things over which they have no control in some cases. Now, I do agree, looking at schools, that many things become faddish, and I think there is no doubt that being trans or non-binary was kind of chic and attractive to young people for a long time, and suddenly in the last few years, and you see a lot more cases of people at least temporarily claiming they're non-binary or they're trans and then changing their mind. But because it was very au courant, it was very, so I think there's some of that in there, and one has to, especially when it comes to minors, I agree completely that one should not be doing surgery on minors because people's, you know, notions of gender evolve, and minors are not capable of not only making those kind of decisions, but they're hormonally they'll change as they get into adolescence and beyond. So I agree that one has to be very careful when it comes to to treatment of minors. On the other hand, when it comes to adults, I'm a I'm a I'm a strong believer in freedom of speech, but also freedom of choice in many ways. And I think as long as you're not hurting others, I tend to be kind of um, um, gracious if I can.